we begin, I'd love for everyone to join with me in an acknowledgement to country. So on behalf of all of our Halad team members here today, Keely, Sarah, Vera and Molly, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we work and live, that being here in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people, and also acknowledge the Indigenous people on whom land you might be connecting with us today, whether that be on Australian soil or not, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So thank you for joining us in that acknowledgement to country, and welcome to our final mini mock series for this September GAMSAT. We're so excited that this is the very last one. Very excited for those of you who've joined us in mini mock 1, 2 and 3 now, but surprisingly there have also been a lot of newcomers to these mini mocks. So if you haven't done this before, open the chat now. That's where the instructions are that I've just dropped, so make sure you have everything set up for yourself, and when you're ready to go, if you can just in the chat message us the word ready, we'll know that we can begin. But in that time, I'll just quickly do a very quick intro to Halad if you have not heard of us before. So if you're not from Melbourne, you might not have heard that we are very much a Melbourne-born non-for-profit. We are not a GAMSAT company. We're actually, the thing that we do is provide free health education into rural communities in the Philippines. And the way that we fund that is very much through our very affordable GAMSAT and med interview prep tuition services, which go on to make that social impact, which is terrific. And this time I'm going to put this up early because almost after every one of these mini mocks, I get the exact same email all the time, which is, how do I get more GAMSAT tuition, GAMSAT help? And so the two main things that we do to help students prepare for every GAMSAT are 6-week intensives. Now these are per section. So there's a section 1, section 2, section 3 intensive that goes for 6 weeks. And we also have mock exams. This time around, there are 4 available full mock exams that you can sit. And I'm flagging this early because a lot of the classes have already sold out already. And generally we have a lot of students asking questions very last minute, and we don't want you guys to miss out on spots. So if you want to have any more of those questions, feel free to ask me about them later on if you like. But very much the team that runs those 6-week intensives is the same team that we have here, so you got to meet them early. So myself, if you have not met me yet, my name is Eliza. I'm the co-founder and managing director here at Halad, which basically means I'm the only one who has not sat the GAMSAT. So please don't ask me the GAMSAT questions, I'll pass them on, and essentially I'll make sure you get all the links to the questions and the answers today. Sarah is our head of GAMSAT and also one of our section 1, 2 tutors, an absolute gun behind literally the GAMSAT at Halad, and probably is one of the people that I always say this, there's no one else who wants to get you into medicine more than Sarah does, and you'll be able to see that in a second. We have Molly and Vera who'll be doing the section 2 today, and be helping you guys through both of one of the prompts there, and they have actually both sat the GAMSAT this May, so they have literally the first-hand guinea pig experience of what it's like to do it online, and unfortunately that's what you guys will be doing. And we have Keely, our section 3 tutor, who's also an absolute chemistry whiz and actually enjoys chemistry in her free time. So that's the team we have today, and the reason why we're all here is just truly because we want to see you guys succeed, and that's why we would like to be here, and also just make the most out of the tutors that are here by asking as many questions via the chat, especially if you finish early or whatnot. If you've been to GAMSAT mini mock 1 and 2, I always take stock here, and before you go on to answer questions, just remind you of the GAMSAT philosophy that we do have here, and that is to always capture the bigger picture of why you're sitting this exam, to answer those questions and choose the options that really reflect the skills and the attributes that you think they're looking for in a medical professional. We don't mentor students who just want those incredible GAMSAT scores and go by luck to try and get the right answer. We definitely do mentor students who want to become incredible medical professionals, and now going through a whole May GAMSAT with a cohort of 150 plus students, we now know there's a massive difference between those two statements. So just think of that philosophy before you go and attempt those questions. So the timing for today, we're going to have 15 minutes straight off after this. I'll hand over to all of our tutors, and you'll get a question and a submission answer booklet to answer 10 questions in 15 minutes for section 1. Then Sarah's going to go through the live explanations, and in the back I'll be tallying up all the results and be showing you how the cohort performed. Then we'll go straight into section 2. Sarah will tell you a little bit more about how much she expects you to write in the 20-minute time period, and Molly and Vera will do the explanations and pick. Are we doing 2 today? Is that right? Not 1? Okay, cool. We'll be picking 2 students at random, their responses, to have live feedback given by our tutors. And so there is a box at the end of the submission form for section 2 that says, am I happy for this to be given live feedback anonymously? So if you are happy for that to be one of the written responses that gets feedback, please tick yes. And then lastly, we'll hand over to Keely. Everyone will have 20 minutes to finish 10 questions, and then Keely will do 20 minutes of explanations there, and then we'll just reflect afterwards. So if you're all ready, I'm going to stop screen sharing and give you the section 1 booklet.
Thanks, Liz. So just while you guys get those links ready, you'll have 15 minutes to complete the questions for section 1. There are 10 questions, and when you are ready to submit your answers, just click submit on the Google form. Okay, so I'll give you 15 minutes and I'll let you know when you have a minute to go, and you can start. All right, so firstly, the average and the median are here, and we had a range between 3 and 8 out of 10, which is awesome. This is a really good average. Well done. So what I wanted to spend a bit of time going over was how to approach some of the texts that were in this mini mock, and also answer some of the questions that you found a bit trickier than others. So what I'd like to do is just start with the first text here. And my tip with long texts is to spend enough time with the text so that you can engage with it fully and so that you can understand what's going on. So it's very easy to rush through these. I will preface this as well with that these are the most common styles of text that you'll be given in section 1. So mastering them will help you to master the crux of the exam. There is obviously a myriad of styles of questions they can ask you about the text. But if you don't know how to dissect it and work with it effectively, you've already got yourself at a disadvantage. So a couple of my tips I'll give you now. The first one is that when you're reading, make sure that you're staying engaged by having ways not to zone out. So I call that active reading. There are many ways that you can active read. It's up to you to find one that works for you. But I would highly recommend that you spend enough time reading it so that after each paragraph you can sum it up. So for example, I like to sum up personally each paragraph in 1 word, and that helps me to stay engaged with the text. So then I know what happened in each paragraph, and then I also know how the text progressed. Another thing I like to ask my students to do sometimes is to relay it back to me or summarize it to me as if I'd never read it. And if they can't do that in their own words, or they can't really put the text together into a sentence, then that gives me a good idea that they haven't really understood it, and I encourage them to reread it and try again. So if you feel like after reading this you still weren't quite sure what the point was, or you couldn't summarize it in a couple of sentences, that's probably something you need to work on. So that would be my recommendation there. In terms of me reading this text, what I got from it was that it was sort of a coming of age story of a son of a doctor. So this person has grown up out in essentially the middle of nowhere, watching his father as a doctor who's been quite separated from the family, and is now at this turning point in his life when he's about to go on his own journey and finding his career. And so I'm able to sum that up. And then if you asked me more parts about it, for example, oh, tell me a little bit more about the coming of age part, or tell me a bit more about the part about him being the son of a doctor, I'd be able to expand on that and tell you what I'd understood from the text. So basically, if you're not able to understand what the critical components are of the text and reiterate them, then it shows that at some point you zoned out or you didn't quite understand what was going on. I think that this can be really helpful as well, because it helps if you feel like there's a word or a few words that you're like, I don't really know what that means. Rather than getting bogged down by parts you don't know what they mean, finding the parts that you do know so you can engage with it can be really helpful. So hopefully, I think this text wasn't too hard of one in terms of gauging. You definitely can see ones which are more convoluted than this. This is more of a narrative style. So this kind of style is probably really good style to practice with initially as well. Okay, so I'm just going to go down and find the questions that you struggled with the most. It looks like question 4 was the hardest one for this text. So I might jump down to the questions and have a look. Yeah, and I like this question because this brings together what I was just mentioning. An appropriate title for the current chapter of the protagonist's life could be, and we got a bit of a range there, and I think B was a popular answer. So B being growing up and D being the journey to nowhere. And so we have, I think B is quite a tempting option here because this does talk about his life growing up a lot. However, that's more asking what did the text discuss as opposed to the current chapter of the protagonist's life. So this is a really key component of A, actively reading the text, and B, actively reading the question to ensure that you're answering what the question's asking. So since this question's asking about what part of life is the protagonist in, well, he's not really growing up anymore. He talks about growing up as a child out in the desert. You could say, oh, but it's growing up in terms of growing into an adult or becoming an adult, which in that case, yes, but an even better one would be the escape route because he's talking about why this is such a pivotal time for him to be leaving and going to college. It's not just because he's old enough to grow up and go to college, it's because he's literally leaving this place that his dad dragged him to for his dad's career. So that's something to bear in mind, is interpreting what was the text really about. And another thing I like to ask myself is what was the main point or the main message of the text? And that's my other sort of active reading solution. And when I asked myself that for this text, it was very much the reason why he wanted to tell us all about his upbringing was to give context as to why in his next jump in his life, it's not going to be him going into medical school. And so just to wrap up that text that I just went over, there's a question in the chat from Bree. I spent too much time reading the first text. Do you have any tips on how to avoid doing that? Firstly, like I mentioned, these texts are the predominating texts in section 1, and often there won't be that many units. So you might get 5 of these texts and you've got over an hour to do it. So you've got ample time, and I would say that spending more time on a text than you think you should is probably still better outcome-wise than if you rush. So that would be the first thing. The other thing is the more time you spend with practicing with text, the quicker you'll become and the more familiar you'll become with the styles of text and the styles of questions. So I would also say that I'm not a very fast reader, and I brought this up the other day and people said, oh, you're just saying that. And I would like to say, no, genuinely, I'm not a quick reader. That's not one of my strengths. But that definitely didn't hinder me from doing well in this section at all. So I think don't fret, start where you're at now or start where you have been at, and just work on getting really good quality and answering the questions well, and you'll find yourself speed up. By the time it comes, I find that it's more section 2 that my students are worrying about with time than section 1. Most of them have no issues come the day. Awesome. Yeah, no worries. So with the second one, the poem, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about how to break down the poems because we did go over a poem last week as well, and I gave some tips there. And so what I would like to sort of mention in terms of the poem is go and watch last week's one if you haven't and get some of the tips. And I'll just point out a couple key ones in terms of the questions that I go over in a second. Just as an FYI, I think that this question has been accidentally put in wrong in the quiz. The answer should be B. Yes, he will never walk again. And so that means that 5 of you actually got it right. So sorry about that. Okay, and let's actually go over that one. And I think that if you chose between B and D, you're doing quite well because they would be the 2 that I want to get it down to. And so I might chat a bit about how to pick between 2 difficult options when you've gotten it down to those final 2. So you've been able to cross out a couple options, but you're still stuck between some. And so this case, we've got he will never walk again and he is paraplegic. And so one of the other skills that's tested in section 1 is can you find good evidence in the text without trying to overfind evidence. And so the reason why D is not the answer is because there's nothing here in this poem that suggests that he's actually paraplegic or that he's unable to move. So that's a little bit too much of an extrapolation of the text. Versus spending his life in bed because he's half a man implies that he's not able to walk. We don't know why he's not able to walk. He could be an amputee, he could be paraplegic, he could be quadriplegic, he could be a lot of things, but all that we can get from the text for sure is that he's unable to get out of his bed. So hopefully that helps with that one. I will also mention, which I think a lot of you nailed, question 7. Sorry, that's my dog barking in the background in case you can hear it, is that this is a very important feature of section 1. And if you went to a school or did a schooling system that doesn't go over poetic conventions a lot and literary conventions, this is a part of section 1 that they still tend to put in, is making sure you know things like metaphors, irony, similes. So just knowing the difference between each convention and how to pick them up. Personifications, another big one. I'm not sure why they still think it's great to ask you about these, but they tend to ask, and so just make sure you know them, and you can just Google and brush up on them, the key poetic conventions, if you're not sure what they are. But it looks like all of you got that one pretty much, which is fantastic. And the ones who didn't, probably the key thing to point out, sorry, I'll just go back, is the difference between metaphor and simile. So simile is when you see words like and as, so when it's comparing, versus metaphor saying that something is something. And so just knowing that key difference, I don't know why they like to ask you about it. I would just like to be clear that section 1 is definitely not an English exam, but for some reason this comes up in poetry. Great. And then this one, diagrams have come back into the GAMSAT. The GAMSAT that was run in May actually had quite a few diagrams in there, and I thought that this was a really nice question to exemplify what happened in the May GAMSAT in terms of that space. And so this diagram is an example of the ability that's tested for you to be able to interpret visual information and synthesize it, even if it's about something you've never seen before. So I know barely anything about product design and development, and this is a diagram that is supposed to illustrate a process that can be followed in order to develop and design a product. And I found that quite difficult to initially interpret. But the idea is that anyone should be able to interpret a diagram that you're given if you're provided enough context and information. So just wanted to go through first how I would approach this kind of question. And I think it's very similar to section 3 as well, in terms of being given a stimulus or a stem and having to link that to diagrammatic information. And so this one is telling us about this model and that it's used for developing something. And it really doesn't matter if you don't know how systems development works. Like I mentioned, I have no idea. And I think it's important not to get caught up on that. And I know I'm treading a little bit into section 3 space here as well. But if you see something and it starts to talk about physics in the first 3 words or chemistry and you really dislike those topics, your brain can tend to shut off. So I think it's important to learn strategies so that you're actively letting the information go in rather than freaking yourself out because you're like, I don't know what that is, or I don't like this topic very much. And that's very much the same with this, is looking at it and going, you know what, my job or my task here is just to break this down and work out what's going on. And it's as simple as that. And so when I follow the V, what I notice is that this left side here is involved predominantly with the design phase, and this right side here is involved in the production phase. So this is like putting the blueprints and the logistics and working things out, and this is the making things happen side. So I've already been able to work it out in my brain what's going on. If you can get to that point, you're going to be in a much better spot than if you're sitting there feeling oversaturated with information. And so from there, you should be able to answer the questions. So I think question 8 was done awesomely. Might focus on question 9 and we'll focus on question 9 and question 10. So if a team were to eliminate phase A, the product is likely to. So I'm going to look at phase A, and sorry, I know that this diagram, the words are slightly blurry, so I hope that they're somewhat readable to you, but phase A says feasibility and conceptual design. So if we took that out, it means that conceptual design would be gone and it would be less feasible or less viable. So if we look at our options, the two that would probably stand out most of all are the lack viability feasibility and suffer from design flaws, which is great because those are the two that the majority of you picked, but you were quite split between, oh no, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one here. The majority of you picked. In terms of fail to develop and dissatisfied market demands, these are very much in this production phase. So marketing, development of the product itself. So we can already get rid of options A and B. In terms of D, suffer from design flaws, whilst there is conceptual design in phase A, and there would possibly be some design issues, we would hope that these design issues would be picked up here in phase B, preliminary design, and also here in phase C, detailed design. So the good news is that there are 3 phases that encompass design. So if the first phase with design in it accidentally got skipped, then hopefully design would get picked up and readdressed, whereas there's no phase here that says that feasibility gets readdressed. And I think this is another important point that's even more pertinent for section 3, is that sometimes we can look at a model like this, and maybe you know more than I do about product design or this, how the V model specifically works, and go, oh no, I know what the answer already is. Yep, if we eliminated phase A in where I work and use this model, then the answer would be this. But all it's asking you to do is read the information there. And so even if you already know tons about this in the real world or how it works, put that bias aside and just read the diagram that they've given you and use your reasoning to help you work through that. So that's why lacking viability or lacking feasibility would be the answer for 9. The answer for 10, gamification would be most beneficial to implement where. So gamification, I'm not going to read this out again, but it's common to be given a bit of extra information to answer a couple of the questions. So it's basically saying that gamification is when they add in an element to their product marketing for consumers to engage with, to make it something that there's better engagement with. So making it more fun or exciting. You've all probably had examples of that where you've participated in a game or a quiz or a contest so that you could get some benefit with a product. And so the best place to do this would be when there can actually already be conceptualization of the product by the consumer. And so this is the kind of question where you'd have to think a little bit and use the phases to help you. So if we go to phase A, where they're only doing conceptual design, to try and get somebody who's an outsider to play a game or be involved in something exciting and then go on to convert that into a sale of your product is highly unlikely because you don't even have a product to show them. So the best place that you can gamify is here in phase E, when you're already trying to validate your product and deploy. The product is ready to deploy. So that would be the best spot for you to implement that in your product development. So whilst it might be better to start thinking about how you're going to design your gamification back in this phase, the point where you'd implement it would be here. So sometimes once you already, and this is more typical of the later questions you can be asked, once you've already understood the model or understood the concept that's been given to you, you might get asked to apply it to a situation and work out what would be the best timing or the best way to apply my model to this situation. So whilst these don't come up very often in section 1, it might only be 1 unit as opposed to the longer texts. Having a think about how you can maximize on your problem solving skills can really help with these kinds of questions and become easy marks for you so that you can work through them quickly and not get sidetracked by them, and then pour more time and energy into those longer texts. Fantastic. Okay, so if you do have further questions about these, or there were ones that you hoped we'd go over but didn't, we will be sending out this explanation document after this evening. And also you're always welcome to email me. I'll put my email in the chat for you. So on that note, we'll get ready to do section 2. Oh, and just one more thing, Eliza has put all of the links for the cohort scores in the chat. It is quite a small sample size this evening, so don't stress too much over the scores. It's more just a bit of an indication of the curving overall. And so if you can now switch to section 2, while you're getting those up, I'll give you 20 minutes and I'll get my timer sorted again. And if you can respond to the prompt by writing an introduction and some paragraphs, up to you how many you write. Pace yourself in terms of how much you think you can write in 20 minutes, but at least an intro and a body paragraph. Or if you like, you can write 2 body paragraphs, or you can write an intro, a body paragraph, and a conclusive statement. So just what you feel you can write, have a go. It's not about doing it perfectly. And if you tick yes, then you'll have a chance to get some live feedback from our tutors when you're done. And you can start now. All right, and that's time. Okay, so similar, I'm going to hand it over to Molly and Vera in a moment. They're going to run you through some explanations around the prompt and also over some of the samples that are randomly chosen. I feel like I was going to tell you something else, but I don't remember what it was. So I'm just going to hand you. Oh, that's right. If you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll make sure that they get answered. Cool. I'll hand it over to Molly and Vera now.
Thanks, Sarah. So I guess I'll just go first. And what I'll be doing for the next few minutes is essentially talking to you about section 2 and then breaking down the prompts that we gave to you tonight. So if you don't mind just sharing your screen again, if that's okay, and I'll get you to pop up the quotes. Okay, perfect. So we've given you a task A example tonight, and task A is normally related to maybe a socio-cultural issue or something to do with economics or politics, etc. And with task A and task B for that matter, you can honestly take any type of structure you like as long as you're writing about something that addresses the overall theme that they've given you. So hopefully reading these 5 quotes here, you were able to work out that it was about anthropology, which is pretty much really a broad topic about the study of human behavior and the processes as to how our society has come to be what it is today. And that involves taking a look at those previous human behaviors and then maybe comparing them to our intrinsic understanding of what it means to be human in this current day and age. It's okay if you don't understand what anthropology is. It's more important that you were able to kind of grasp the essence of what they were asking you. And often ASA will help you out by giving you opposing or complementing views on the theme that encourages you to kind of explore that depth of thinking. I just want to add that, yeah, this was a pretty difficult topic that we gave you, and the quotes were intentionally a bit vague and broad, and it might not have been immediately obvious as to what the overall theme was, and I do appreciate that some of these quotes are rather long-winded, and there's a lot going on, and if you do see something like this, it's important not to panic, but to instead look for some commonalities or trends in the ideas. I just wanted to point out maybe a common mistake that students tend to make, and that is zooming in on certain words. For example, one might see the word open-mindedness or the phrase like human differences or going out into the villages, and they could write an absolutely wonderful essay on this, but they would have still failed to write to the overall topic that ASA wanted you to write about. And in a sense, they pretty much won't score well in that case. So it's really important to take a holistic view and understand the overall theme of the essay. Just as a side note, a really good exercise is to be able to explain it to a friend or your parents, mum or dad, about what the overall theme of the essay is, and that will allow you to really kind of key in on the fact that you have understood what they wanted you to write about. In a second, we might just go through each of the quotes really quickly and kind of break it down. This was something that I personally did with my friend during preparation. We would go through each of the quotes and then talk to each other about what we thought that the quote meant, and then maybe come up with examples as well that kind of supplemented this thinking. So just looking at quote 1, so yeah, boom, there's like an idea here that maybe the world isn't quite so open or safe in terms of differences in human behaviors or opinions. And then my next thought would be, maybe why is this the case? And then also if I had any examples of this occurring. Quote 2, so when we think about the sciences, we typically think, you know, your typical biology, chemistry, physics, etc. Yes, evolution is important, but I feel like we often associate this purely with the physical evolution of maybe our bodies at a very kind of biological level, because that's just simply what we're taught throughout our life. And anthropology takes that one step further and considers adding that human aspect to our evolution, such as our behaviors, why do we act in certain ways, and maybe what do we want from our lives as well. Question 3 is kind of getting to the core of anthropology now. So we have I would probably say an innate curiosity for trying to understand other people or cultures, and you really need to be able to make those connections with others, and the only way we can do that is to stay open-minded. And if we weren't able to do this, then society wouldn't progress and our behaviours essentially would remain stagnant and they wouldn't change. Quote 4, so I guess anthropology is a social science. You can't exactly sit in your room, read a textbook and try to understand other cultures or people. You really need to go out and immerse yourself directly in the villages, the cities, the towns, seeing all the aspects as to why these natives live, behave, and I guess work in their specific ways. Looking at quote 5 now, I like to think that yes, biologically all humans are the same, but what makes us different is our behaviors, our little quirks, our personalities, and our own unique perceptions of the world. And also our differences should also be something that should be embraced or even not embraced, depending on which perspective you chose to take when you read this quote. So essentially all these quotes are just commenting in some way or another on human behaviors and the ability or ways that we strive to understand other people in the world. So a good response would have needed to address this topic of human behavior in societies. I might just move on now to a live critique of one of the essays you guys wrote, and I will hand over to Vera to lead the first one.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the explanation, Molly. And as Molly said, we will quickly be going through one of the sample essays that one of you guys wrote and Sarah has selected for us. Okay, all right. Let me just quickly share my screen. Oh, no, Sarah's got it. Okay, great. Sarah's got it up. No worries. I think what I'm going to get you to do is I'll give everyone 2 minutes to read this sample essay. I'll set a quick timer on my phone. Hopefully you guys can read as much of this essay as you possibly can. And I'll quickly run through a couple of points that I picked up as I was reading. So I'll set it for 2 minutes and you guys can start reading. Okay, that should have been about 2 minutes and we can jump straight into the explanation. Okay, first of all, I think Molly, your explanation was really lovely and I think it touched on some really important points. Something that I would like to mention is that even though we've got all these quotes over here, you don't necessarily have to be blinded by the scope of what the quotes touch upon. A really good piece of advice that I got when I was studying for the GAMSAT, and specifically with section 2, was that your contention or your main idea can read like a 6th quote. So it has to be touching upon a theme, obviously, it has to fall under that category, but it doesn't necessarily have to actually follow the lines of logic of one of these quotes or all of them. So I really like this essay in that it has a very clear direction. Something that I would really like to point out is finding your voice when it comes to essays. So having a really clear and distinct voice and actually speaking from your heart is something that's really, really important. I've come across lots of essays where students kind of see an essay. Well, it's very clear they see an essay or see some things that they've read and they've really enjoyed and essentially regurgitate that in their own essays. And it comes across as not really being their own. But this person has clearly got a very sound understanding of anthropology and takes us through a couple of facets of it. Yeah, and I would like to point out that the language use is really lovely and sophisticated, but more importantly, it's quite clear and very confident, which reads very nicely. I think it's really easy to get caught up in your ideas and go off on a tangent, but this person does quite a good job. So one piece of advice that I would probably give here is I really like this introduction and the way that this person is able to actually feed us the definition of anthropology and talk us through it. And this is really good for demonstrating your understanding of it and your wider reading. I think that what I would recommend is maybe narrowing down what you're actually talking about. Obviously, a lot of things are being touched upon here. We've got societal normalities, cultural behaviors, and if you continue to read on, during that 2 minutes, you'll see that this person actually talked about cultures more often and how they actually influence our understanding of human behavior, which is really nice. But yeah, I would probably recommend maybe cutting down not cutting down necessarily, but narrowing down the spectrum of what you're talking about and being more direct. Okay. One other thing that I look for is if a student has stuck to the theme, which this student evidently has. Yeah, the structure of this essay is also really nice. I like that if you actually read through the essay and the paragraphs, there's a nice flow in the logic, and one sentence goes on to the next. It should read like point A, you know, because of point A, point B becomes a thing, because of point B, point C becomes a thing. So there's a nice logical progression throughout the paragraphs. And like I just mentioned before, I really liked that this person talked about Western Eastern cultures and how there's a difference between them, and obviously how that influences our outlook on human behavior, which is a very niche and nice perspective. A thing that I would probably recommend is using more examples. I think someone's got their audio on. I can hear my own voice. Yeah, great. Thank you so much for muting, Tim. But yeah, use of example in this paragraph would be really nice, actually. And this example doesn't have to necessarily have to be something that you read through a newspaper or something. It can very much be like a form of popular culture. If you've watched a TV show, or you've read a book, or just something that you happen to see in an everyday life example, I would definitely recommend putting in an example, and that kind of exemplifies how that how whatever you're talking about transcends just the essay and, you know, actually applies to real life. So yeah, really well done to whoever wrote this essay. And yeah, this does sound like a really good essay. I would love to read the rest of it. But that's pretty much my feedback for this essay. Molly, I believe you have an essay that you want to talk about, sample two?
Yes, so thanks, Vera. If you don't mind, I'll just have you continue sharing.
Yeah, I'll continue sharing my screen. Yep.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Awful at tech, and I probably might screw it up, but thanks. Yeah, so I will just be giving my feedback on the second sample essay that we have here. I just wanted to start off by saying that I do like the way that you have written this essay so far. I think that your the points that you have mentioned are really kind of factual, straight to the point. There is limited amounts of like floral and verbose language, which does work the way you've written it so far. I also do think that you've used a level of inclusive language, and I think that's always really favorable because it does kind of make sure that you really involve the person who is reading your essay. Yeah, I remember when writing my own essays as well, I did prefer a very kind of colloquial tone when I was writing my essays, making sure that I use like a lot of we's and stuff like that instead of I. Yeah, so just as a side note, I do think that the theme has been missed a little bit in this essay. I think you have possibly just drifted a little bit and kind of honed in or zoomed in on maybe the keyword of open-mindedness, which isn't a terrible thing, because I do think you have also managed to bring it back a little bit and connect it to the fact that there are different viewpoints in the world. The only thing that I would change is that maybe make it less specific to open-mindedness and focus more on understanding human behaviors and the world in general. Yeah, something I always kind of try to drive home and kind of hone in my students as well is to make it as personal as possible. So I like how you've just kind of stated a lot of viewpoints at the moment. What I would change is maybe include an example that is super, super personable to you, maybe drawing upon your own personal experiences or something that's kind of happened in society. Something else I might change as well as a side note is I generally choose not to paraphrase the quotes as much as possible and to not include the names of people being quoted, just because I think that if you are able to kind of, maybe if you focus less on trying to answer a specific quote, it'll allow you to kind of view the whole theme a bit more holistically. Yeah, so I do think that something else I would do is probably expand a bit more on your paragraphs. I do appreciate that the time was very limited, but yeah, just taking the time to make sure that every sentence is followed by maybe a bit more elaboration, and then an example, and then something that ties it back to the overall theme. Yeah, I do think that if I were to keep going with this essay, I might just have to pare it back more, remove that kind of term of open-mindedness. I do see that it pops up a lot, and then yeah, link it a lot more back to the topic of just human differences, behaviors, and societal changes. Yeah, I'd be interested to see, because I think this essay probably has kind of gone a little bit off topic, but I'd be interested to see what you do right, given the fact that we've now kind of explained what the various quotes mean and the overall theme of the essay. So if you did want to maybe try and attempt it again, I'd be more than happy to read it if you did want to email me. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Molly and Vera. Just to wrap that up, exactly like Molly just said, if you had any questions about section 2 or what you wrote, or you're confused about anything, or the prompt confused you, more than welcome to email any of us about that. And just one other tiny thing I wanted to bring up, if you could just scroll back up, since you're already screen sharing, thanks Vera, to the first sample.
Perfect, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and echoing exactly what Vera said already, it's right on track with the topic and the prompt. The one thing I would say is that something that's a little bit different about section 2 essays than perhaps essays you've written in the past is that they are shorter, and it is supposed to be concise, and that particularly this paragraph, this first body paragraph, is quite chunky. There's a lot going on there. So I would chunk this one in half and have 2 separate sort of topic sentences to have 2 clear points. So like Vera mentioned, it's quite well signposted, but it is all grouped together. So it's a very easy thing to fix, and I'd encourage you to grab what you've written and just split it up into 2 separate points, and that should help that to be more readable and easier for me as the marker to read through and know what your points are. Yeah, beautiful. Okay, so on that note, what I'm going to do now is move you all onto section 3. So I will share my screen now. You'll have 20 minutes and, all right, great. And we'll start, okay? And you have 20 minutes.
A quick rundown of just the scores first, and then we'll take you through some of the questions and the answers to them. So overall, guys, I just wanted to say good job. I know the scores probably don't reflect this the best, but you've actually done a really good job answering these questions, because I think these questions, whilst they're not the hardest and that the skills they're requiring to use, and that there's a bit of basic math, graph interpretation, and getting information from a bit of text, they've got some very typical like GAMSAT tricks in there, I like to think, particularly the first then, which we'll go through, in that there's a lot of like confounding information, and sifting through that to find what's really important is probably the hardest part of them. So you guys have done a really good job. Okay, I might switch back now to the questions, because we'll go through those. We won't go through all of them. Oh, no, sorry, I've changed, not you guys. Here we go. All right, so this first question is physical chemistry question, and this is the typical give you something you've probably never even heard of before and overload you with an absolute ton of information, most of which isn't really, sorry, not relevant. It's all relevant. It's all relating to what metal is used in metalloproteins to transport oxygen, but it's not relevant to you answering the questions. It's interesting, it's cool to learn about, but you really don't need to know about it. So really identifying what you do need to know to answer the question is probably the biggest thing. And again, this heme structure, classic distractor. You do not need it all to answer this question. It's just there and looks cool and fancy and makes everyone freak out. We've kind of echoed it in every section tonight. But like my number one bit of advice, and I tell all my students this every time, whenever you first see a question, step 1, before you even think about what it's about, remind yourself to not freak out. And for everyone, that will be something different. For me, it's whenever I see a physics question, I literally have to tell myself, don't freak out and don't hyperventilate, because that just like is anxiety provoking for me. So just give yourself that mental reminder if you need to, because it's very rarely as hard as what you think it is. Okay, so for question 1, we had a bit of a split between options A and C. And so we are obviously gaining the relation that before 1.5 billion years and after 1.5 billion years, there is that shift in the middle, but it's which way and which one came first is the bit of the decision. So the correct answer was C. And for this one, we kind of need to go back to our STEM, where it told us that before 1.5 billion years ago, we were in a reducing environment. So we kind of expect our metals to be in a more reduced form. And to be more reduced, they're going to have more electrons. They're going to be in this lower state. So we're considering our Fe2 or our Cu1. There are more reduced states of those metals. And considering copper 1 is largely insoluble in this form, we're going to go, that's probably not going to be very good at transporting oxygen around in a liquid system if it's precipitating out as a solid. So Fe2 is going to be a much more better metal to use in this state, because in those reducing conditions and in this form, it is actually going to be soluble, so it can carry out its function. In comparison to an organism that evolved after 1.5 billion years ago, it doesn't say it here, but by the fact that it's not in a reducing environment and oxygen is present, we can infer it's a more oxidized environment. So we're going to be looking at these more oxidized states of metals, so Fe3 versus copper 2+. Again, this is kind of the opposite. Fe3 is the one that's insoluble, whilst copper 2 is the soluble form. So this is the one that's going to actually be useful. And when we see that in our answers, we can see that organism A, so the one that evolved early in the reducing environments, will have that iron as its metal, versus the organism B, which will have copper. So that's really just sifting through that information. And all you need to take out the information was the metals, whether they were soluble or insoluble, and that little bit about the timeline at the start. The rest of it, really irrelevant for that question. But surprisingly enough, despite that, you guys all did really, really well on question 2 and question 3 as well. So we might just skip over those in the interest of time's sake. Again, it's just interpreting a bit of information and applying it to yourself. There's some explanations on the document which you guys will receive at the end of today. So if you really want to go back over them, the explanations are quite thorough, so you should be able to follow along if it was a question that you struggled with. So questions 4 and 5 were actually done quite poorly. So we'll go through those. And here they've provided you a little bit of extra information. So not only have they given us all this irrelevant information in the actual STEM itself, they've piled on more and more for you guys here. So don't freak out. It's more just, what do we actually need to know out of all of this? So it's we're kind of shifting gears here, and we're looking at absorption of light and the color that we see and how it relates. So it's giving you here the different colors and the wavelengths. And it's also giving you here the Beer-Lambert law, which relates how much they absorb to their concentration, and this value here, the molar absorptivity. Jeez, I can never say that one. So question 4 is looking directly at that Beer-Lambert law, and for some reason, option D has just not included here. Anyway, hope no one chose option D. Looking here, we need to work out, so we're just subbing numbers into our law. A little bit of basic maths. We know that our A equals ELC, and we know that we want to find A. The question is asking us what is the intensity that's going to be detected on the UV spec, which is what's going to measure the light absorbance. We need to work out the molar absorptivity is given to us, so we can plug that one straight into the formula. Our concentration is where I think most students will probably go wrong for this one, in that whilst we have a 0.2 molar hemocyanin solution, if we recall back to our actual STEM, and this is where it is important to make sure you are reading the actual information there, it tells us that hemocyanin is a dicopper protein, which means it actually has 2 copper centers per molecule. So whilst we have a 0.2 molar hemocyanin solution, the concentration of copper in there, which is what's actually absorbing the light and what is going to be contributing to this, is actually 0.4 molar. So we sub our concentration as 0.4, and it tells you in the question here that the path length is 1 centimeter. And from there, it's some pretty, you can do very approximate math. In fact, I think I literally, when I was working out in my head, literally went, okay, this is our molar absorptivity. It's times by 0.4. I'll look, approximately half of that is closest to option B. the answers they've given you are not that close together, so you really don't need to waste your time doing lots of math and long multiplication and all kinds of things that just confuse your brain. Keep it nice and simple. Rounding is a really good tool. Just make sure if you do have a question where options are quite close together, make sure you are keeping track of your rounding, whether you've rounded up or whether you round down, so that what you've calculated, you can then kind of translate that into what the closest answer will be. And this last one, I think there's a little bit of confusion here, and that most people have chosen option A, but we need to kind of go back to a bit of basic physics principles here. And this is probably something that wasn't included in the question, that if something is to appear a certain color, it's not absorbing that color. It's absorbing all the other colors of light, and that's the color of light that's being reflected off so that you can see. So if this vanabin, if it absorbs red light really well, you're not going to be able to see the red light. You're going to see all the other colors that it doesn't absorb well. And so if we then go back to our little color waves here, so we're absorbing red light, so we're not going to see this. We're going to see some other color, which is a mix of the other wavelengths we don't see. So we're not seeing red. We're probably not going to see orange either, because that has a red component to it. So that's not likely to be seen. And the other options were blue or colorless. And in distinguishing between them, first of all, it's told you that it absorbs red the best, which means it doesn't absorb the others very well. So we are likely to get blue light being reflected off our solution and be able to see it. If a solution were to be colorless, you would assume it be really good at absorbing all colors of light, because no visible light is able to be reflected so you can see it. So blue is the most option here, because we're absorbing this red really, really well. So we're not going to see it, and we're going to get a mix of the colors, which is likely to be in our blue region. So that is a really tricky question. And I suppose that one does require a little bit of very basic prior knowledge and is a little bit physicsy. I know it's not ideal for everyone, but that's as complex as you need to make it. Moving on to question 2, this one actually is a physics question, but we're dealing with interpreting a graph, which is a very important skill. You'll see it time and time again. I think Sarah talked about a diagram in section 1. Same kind of thing applying here. Make sure you know what you're looking at and understand what is actually going on. And we've got a bit of a stem to accompany it here. And look, most of this I'd say isn't really relevant. It's just explaining it in different ways and paraphrasing itself over and over again. When I read this stem, I think the biggest thing I take away from it is that there's 2 homeostatic mechanisms and they clash when you're exercising. And then this thermal compensability, I cannot speak today to save myself, equation down here and what these variables actually represent. That's all you really need to take away from it. The rest is just extra things to have a quick skim of, but not really have to take in too much. So for this one, we answered our first 2 questions really, really well. So again, I might skip over those and we'll spend a bit more time going over the questions that weren't done quite as well. So these ones are all pretty easy. We're just looking straight at our graph and we're considering our 2 athletes and how are they doing at different points on the graph. So I think we've all done that really well. So we've understood what the graph is actually telling us, which is awesome. Let's start with question 4 and 5. Again, these 2 were not done well. Question 4 in particular is one that I think is quite tricky. And in fact, the answer is A for this one. And I think only one person got it correct. So it is a tricky one and it does take a little bit of explanation. So for here, we're considering athlete B and athlete A again, and at the 10,000 meter distance. So we need to think of our graph and what's occurring at 10,000 meters. So here we can see that we have athlete A has a higher, athlete B has a higher power output than athlete A. And as we can see that as we reach about 10,000, so probably a little bit past these dots in reality, but around this region, there is an increase in the total heat production. So they're obviously running really hard. They've been running for a real long time now, and their thermal compensability and their ability to dissipate that heat is starting to fail. And they can see that temperature is actually rising from here on out, despite their power remaining the same. So they're kind of reaching their limits now. It's as much as they can dissipate their heat, and we're going to see that temperature rise. So then how do we relate this to what the actual question is asking? So it's asking which athlete is most likely to have a greater internal body temperature. So the most prominent answer for this one was answer C, but in fact, our correct answer is option A. So we've all pretty much recognized that athlete A is going to have the higher internal body temperature, and that makes sense if we consider our graph. Athlete A is operating at a lower power output. Yep. So they're having to use more of their energy to get rid of the heat because they're not as fit or whatever other reason. And they're not able to run at the same rate and have that same energy output as what athlete B is, who's obviously more adapted to running long distance styles like this. But the reason whether we have a lower thermal compensability or higher thermal compensability is where people seem to get stuck up. And so for that, I would always, whenever you see something like this, and particularly if you're weighing up between two options or you're not really sure what's going on, go back to your little bit of STEM and go back to the information that's relevant. Because I don't know what thermal compensability is. I can't even say it right. But if I come back to here, I have a look at our little equation here, and it's our E rec over our E max. It tells us here it's a ratio between the result of the environment and host factors. So that host is going to be your ability to get rid of it. Your environment is what's around you. So is it a humid day? Is it a hot day? What speed are you running? What all these other factors and how they influence it. So this environmental factor is going to be fairly similar for both runner A and runner B. There might be some slight differences, like what shorts were they wearing? Was someone wearing like long shorts? Was someone wearing short ones? But it's not going to be overall that different. They're running in the same environment, the same length race. Everything else is going to be quite similar, but their ability to cope with it and their ability to dissipate that heat is what's going to make it different. So we've already worked out that athlete A is going to be the one with the higher internal body temperature because they're not as fit. They're not as effective at running on, which means they're going to have this lower Emax value. They're not going to be as good. Their host and their intrinsic factors are not going to be as good at getting rid of that heat. So if this number is lower, it's going to give us a higher thermal compensability. So when we go back, and that makes sense with our answer here, it's answer A being correct. Athlete A will have the higher thermal compensability and have the higher internal body temperature. And number 5, this one actually was done well. What was wrong in the question, in the quiz, it's saying option A is correct, option B is the correct one. And again, this is thinking back to our host versus our environmental factors. So cardiovascular function, sodium content in sweat, internal core temperature, they're all very intrinsic factors. They're not things you can generally control very well. Your body will automatically go along functioning in its normal physiological manner. Athletes' clothing, that is something that can change. That's part of your environment that will have that influence. Yeah, so that's all I'll go over for these questions today. For both those questions, the first few ones were done really well. It was just some more of those last ones that were a little bit more challenging. And again, it's really just about extrapolating information that's provided to you in the STEM and getting rid of all the nonsense that really you don't need to answer the question. GAMSAT will love to do that. They'll give you a nice little story and a nice little mini lecture almost on an interesting topic, and it is interesting. But at the end of the day, you've got it's your job to work out what is relevant and to answer the question. And yeah, so I won't go on too much. Probably I just might give one more last bit of advice, and this is something particularly if you're really unsure, really stuck where to start for a section 3 question. Think about how you approach it rather than working out what the answer is. And I think this is a good skill you can practice when you're just doing practice questions. Even for the really easy questions, think, how did I get to my answer? What was I thinking? What was I doing? How did I get there? And it gives you a bit of a tool bank for when you do get those situations where you're really stuck. And I'll hand it back off to Lights now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Keely, Molly, Vera, Sarah, for all of your time today. And I'm sure on behalf of all the students, thank you so much for all the help that you've gone through so thoroughly. Just to cap off, I'm going to quickly screen share what we usually do. And if you have been to any of the mini mocks, you know that our big thing with all of the way that we teach is very reflective. And so the last thing we like to cap off with is if you can just think about and reflect on what you've just spent the last 2 hours investing in your own learning to do. What is the one big thing that you've taken away from this mini mock. And if you can share that in the chat with our tutors, they would really appreciate that, and it helps keep you accountable for your learning too. And whilst you go ahead and do that, I guess what's next, I've just dropped a few links in the chat below, and if you're watching this on a recording, it's in the event description. One, if you have not yet joined our Facebook community through our Facebook group or our Facebook page, then I highly recommend you do so, because that's where we post all of our free GAMSAT resource, and heads up, there are a ton, so you don't want to miss any of them. Second link I've dropped is a link to our interactive calendar, so you don't miss anything that's coming up. And in particular, one that's coming up next week is this event that we're doing called Doctors with Side Hustles, essentially to give everyone a bit more perspective on sort of what a real life doctor who is doing some other things other than med school could be. And we have some great guests on that one. So use that interactive calendar to see everything that's coming up so you don't miss anything. And like I sort of prefaced at the very beginning, for all of our GAMSAT exams, we do have the 6-week intensives and the mock exams before each one. So in particular, this 6-week intensive is going to begin on the 4th of August. And essentially it'll be 6 weeks of classes. You'll have 2 hours of an online class each week, plus a ton of other content of homework and things to do. And that is all at a very affordable price of $189 per intensive. And if you are one of the participants in this mini mock today, and you are going to purchase a 6-week intensive in the next sort of 2 days, please make sure you use this promo code, so we know that you have come to this mini mock and invested that time already, sort of pre-launching yourself into some intense GAMSAT study. And our Section 2 tutors will make sure that they do a cross-mark full Section 2 written response for you, so you can send in a full response to one of the prompts that we had today, or we can just use the one that you've already made and submitted. The last point to that is also make sure you holler at a friend and make sure you let them know, because there is a 10% off friend discount if 2 friends sign up for those 6-week intensives or the mock exams. And all you have to do is just email Carleen for that. But otherwise, I will leave it there. Thank you so much for coming along and supporting Halad, as well as investing in your own learning. And we hope to see you very, very soon, whether it's at one of our events or whether it's at one of our GAMSAT intensives. Thanks, guys. See ya.
Thank you.